September 12, 1958, just before midnight, something felt wrong in Harlem. Big Sam stood near the bar at Lenox Lounge, his hand tight around the grip of a pistol he had carried for years. That gun had protected Bumpy Johnson through raids, shootouts, and street wars. Tonight, it was meant to end him. $50,000. That was the price New York's 5 crime families placed on Bumpy's life, and the man chosen to collect it wasn't a rival or an outsider. It was his bodyguard, his closest protector. The man Bumpy trusted more than anyone else in the room. Sam had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Walk in, wait for distraction, one clean shot, then disappear. As Sam stepped forward, Bumpy sat at his usual table, relaxed, unaware, his back turned. The opportunity was perfect. Sam raised the gun, aimed carefully, and pulled the trigger. The sound that followed was not a gunshot. It was a hollow click, the kind of sound that stops time. Music died mid-note. Conversations vanished. A room filled with people froze in disbelief. Slowly, Bumpy Johnson turned his chair around. He didn't rush, he didn't panic. He simply looked at Sam with calm, steady eyes. Then he spoke, quietly, clearly, 5 words that would echo through Harlem for decades. "I've been expecting you." In that instant, Sam understood something terrible. This wasn't a failed hit, this was a trap. What no one in that room knew was that Bumpy Johnson had known about the assassination attempt for nearly 3 weeks, and instead of running, hiding, or killing the traitor immediately, he had decided to teach a lesson, one that would change how power worked in Harlem forever. By 1958, Bumpy Johnson was no ordinary crime figure. He wasn't just a numbers boss or a street enforcer. He was Harlem's shield, the man who kept outsiders from tearing the neighborhood apart. The Italian mafia had been circling Harlem for years, desperate to control the numbers racket that generated millions from small bets placed by working people. Everywhere else in New York had fallen under mafia influence. Harlem had not. The reason was simple. Bumpy Johnson stood in the way. He didn't rule by terror alone, he ruled by balance. When families fell behind on rent, help appeared. When police harassment increased, phone calls were made. When Italian crews pushed too hard, they were pushed back harder. The mafia tried force. It failed. They tried negotiation. It failed. They tried politics. It failed. By the late 1950s, frustration turned into desperation. That desperation led to a private meeting of the 5 families. The topic was singular. Bumpy Johnson. Frank Costello spoke first, blunt and irritated. Violence hadn't worked. Bribes hadn't worked. Influence hadn't worked. Carlo Gambino listened quietly before offering a solution. "We stop going after him directly," he said. "We go after someone he trusts." That was when the name Big Sam came up. Sam Foster had been Bumpy's shadow since 1953. He was massive, loyal, and proven. He had taken bullets, kept secrets, and stayed silent through every storm. If anyone could get close enough, it was him. The family sent a specialist, a man who didn't threaten or intimidate. He persuaded. His name was Tony Maroney. 3 weeks before the failed shooting, Sam was approached outside his apartment. A black Cadillac, a calm voice, a short conversation that changed everything. Tony didn't talk about power or loyalty. He talked about bills, about hospitals, about Sam's daughter, sick and struggling, treatments piling up. Then he opened a briefcase, $50,000 in clean cash, enough to save her, enough to leave New York forever, all for one bullet. Sam didn't answer immediately, but the briefcase stayed with him. The choice followed him home, followed him into sleepless nights. Eventually, he called the number Tony left behind. He agreed. What Sam didn't know was that before he ever entered that Cadillac, Bumpy Johnson already knew. Bumpy had eyes everywhere, people the mafia never noticed. Bartenders, drivers, parking attendants. One of them saw Tony's car outside Sam's building, wrote down the plate, delivered the information within hours. Bumpy didn't react emotionally. He didn't panic. He watched. He saw the stress in Sam's face, the hesitation, the internal war. Most men would have eliminated the threat immediately. Bumpy didn't. He chose patience. He contacted a gunsmith he trusted and ordered a weapon that looked perfect but could never fire. Then he waited for the right moment. He sent Sam away on an errand, entered the apartment, swapped the gun. From that point on, the outcome was locked in. Bumpy wasn't avoiding betrayal, he was exposing it. When the moment finally came at Lenox Lounge, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The failed shot wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He revealed the truth calmly, publicly. He explained that Sam's daughter's medical bills had already been paid. That help had always been there. What he needed to know was which choice Sam would make when pushed, loyalty or money. Sam collapsed under the weight of it. Bumpy didn't kill him. He exiled him, ordered him to leave Harlem forever, and more importantly, to deliver a message back to the mafia, that they couldn't buy loyalty in Harlem, that Bumpy Johnson always knew what was coming. By morning, the story had spread across the East Coast. From Boston to Baltimore, the message was clear. The five families met again, furious but defeated. Carlo Gambino spoke plainly. "We leave Harlem alone." For the first time, the mafia backed down without a war. Bumpy Johnson lived another decade after that night. He didn't die by gunfire. He died quietly years later in the same place where he had proven his greatest strength. Not violence, awareness. He had turned an assassination into a lesson, and Harlem never forgot it. Continuing seamlessly from there, the aftermath of that night settled into Harlem like a quiet storm. Nothing exploded. No retaliation followed. And that silence spoke louder than gunfire ever could. The mafia didn't respond because they couldn't. Any move they made would only prove what everyone already understood. Bumpy Johnson was always ahead. He didn't just survive attacks. He absorbed them, studied them, and turned them into warnings. Harlem residents felt it immediately. The streets didn't celebrate, but they walked a little taller. There was comfort in knowing that the man protecting their world wasn't reckless, wasn't emotional, and wasn't predictable. Inside the underworld, the failed hit rewrote strategy. Leaders stopped asking how to remove Bumpy and started asking why every attempt collapsed before it began. Informants dried up, approaches stalled, plans were abandoned halfway through. No one trusted that their conversations were private anymore. The fear wasn't that Bumpy would kill them, it was that he already knew what they were thinking. That kind of uncertainty paralyzes even the most powerful organizations. Harlem became a blind spot Ney wanted to test. Bumpy himself didn't change much after that night. He didn't brag, he didn't tighten his circle. If anything, he appeared more relaxed. He returned to his routines, his conversations, his quiet authority. But those closest to him noticed something different. He trusted less, observed more, and spoke even fewer words. When he did speak, people listened. His power no longer came from the threat of violence, but from the certainty that resistance was pointless. He had crossed a threshold few men ever reached, the point where reputation alone did the work. The story of Big Sam didn't fade either. It became a cautionary tale, retold in whispers, not about betrayal but about choice, about how desperation can bend even the strongest loyalties, and how real leadership understands that weakness without exploiting it. Some saw mercy in Bumpy's decision. Others saw cruelty in the public exposure. But everyone agreed on one thing. That night proved Bumpy Johnson wasn't just surviving Harlem, he was shaping it. As the years moved forward, Harlem continued to change. New music, new faces, new struggles. But one thing remained constant. No outside power ever tried to take it by force again. Not openly, not quietly, not indirectly. The lesson of Lenox Lounge had settled deep into the criminal world's memory. Some territories weren't worth the cost. Some men weren't worth the risk. When Bumpy eventually passed away in 1968, there was no scramble for power the way Outsy Durs predicted. The structure held, the rules remained. That was his final victory. Not dominance, but continuity. He left behind something stronger than fear. He left behind understanding. And that's why his story endures. Not because of how many men he fought, or how much money he controlled, but because of how completely he mastered the unseen parts of power. Information, timing, human nature. On that September night in 1958, Bumpy Johnson didn't just stop an assassination. He reminded the world that the sharpest weapon is knowing what comes next, and acting before anyone else realizes the game has already been decided. Years after that night, people still struggled to explain why Harlem remained different when so many other neighborhoods fell apart. Crime existed everywhere, but Harlem carried an invisible order that outsiders couldn't penetrate. That order wasn't written down. It lived in memory. It lived in the understanding that crossing certain lines brought consequences you couldn't predict or escape. Bumpy Johnson had taught that lesson without turning the streets into a battlefield. And because of that, His influence lasted far longer than gunfire ever could. Young men who entered the life in the 1960s heard his name before they learned the rules. Older hustlers spoke of him carefully, not with worship, but with certainty. They explained how power didn't always roar. Sometimes it waited, sometimes it watched, and sometimes it allowed an enemy to think they were why. Nenning right up until the moment everything collapsed. That philosophy shaped Harlem's underworld long after Bumpy himself stopped walking its streets. Law enforcement never stopped trying to dismantle what he built. Files grew thicker, investigations dragged on. But nothing ever quite landed. Witnesses disappeared. Testimony changed. Evidence fell apart. It wasn't corruption alone that protected him. It was the absence of chaos. Harlem under Bumpy didn't look like a war zone, and that made it harder to justify aggressive action. Order, even criminal order, created blind spots that bureaucracy struggled to see through. Privately, Bumpy understood the cost of living that way. He carried the weight of every decision, every compromise, every line crossed to keep Harlem standing. He knew loyalty was fragile. He knew respect had an expiration date. That knowledge kept him sharp. It kept him humble in a way few powerful men ever are. He never believed his legend. He treated it like a tool, useful but dangerous if trusted too much. When his death finally came in 1968, it didn't shock anyone close to him. Heart attacks don't announce themselves the way bullets do, and maybe that was fitting. Bumpy Johnson had spent his life avoiding the obvious ending. He didn't go out in a blaze of violence. He went out the same way he lived in later years, quietly, on his own terms, in familiar surroundings. Afterward, journalists argued over how to remember him: criminal, protector, manipulator, leader. None of those words captured the whole truth. Harlem remembered him differently. Not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a man who refused to let his home be taken. A man who understood that survival sometimes requires standing still while the world rushes toward its own mistakes. And that is why the story keeps being told. Not because it glorifies crime, but because it reveals something deeper about power. The strongest move isn't always attack. Sometimes it's patience, sometimes it's preparation, and sometimes it's letting your enemy pull the trigger, only to discover the game was decided long before that moment ever arrived. As Harlem moved further away from the world Bumpy Johnson had known, the echoes of his methods still shaped how people handled pressure. When conflicts arose, elders advised patience before reaction. When outsiders pushed too hard, the response was measured rather than explosive. That culture of restraint didn't happen by accident. It was learned through years of watching a man who understood that survival depended on timing more than force. Bumpy had shown that the loudest move was often the weakest, and the quietest decision could carry the longest shadow. Those who studied his life closely noticed something else that set him apart. Bumpy never confused control with ownership. He didn't believe Harlem belonged to him. He believed he belonged to Harlem. That difference mattered. It shaped how he treated people, how he intervened, and how he stepped back when intervention wasn't needed. Power to him was responsibility before it was privilege. That belief earned him loyalty money could never buy, even when temptation was placed directly in front of those closest to him. The story of the failed assassination continued to circulate, not as gossip, but as instruction. It reminded people that desperation makes men predictable, that threats reveal more than they hide, that loyalty, when tested, exposes both strength and weakness. Bumpy understood all of it because he paid attention to human nature, not just street dynamics. He didn't see people as pieces to be moved blindly. He saw pressure points, fears, and motivations. That insight allowed him to stay ahead while others reacted too late. In later years, as new figures rose and fell, Harlem avoided the constant power vacuums that destroyed other neighborhoods. There was continuity even when leadership changed hands. Systems remained, rules were understood. That stability traced directly back to the example Bumpy set. He built something that didn't rely entirely on his presence, which is rare in worlds driven by ego and fear. His absence didn't cause collapse because his thinking had already taken root. Looking back, it becomes clear why so many attempts to remove him failed. Enemies focused on his body, not his mind. They planned bullets when they should have planned patience. They underestimated observation, preparation, and restraint. Bumpy never made that mistake. He treated every quiet moment as preparation for the next storm. That is why his story still holds weight. Not because it glorifies the life he lived, but because it reveals how power actually works when stripped of noise. It shows that control is earned long before it's challenged, and survival is decided long before the trigger is pulled. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone, and Harlem carried that understanding forward long after his name stopped appearing in headlines. As the decades passed, Harlem continued to evolve, shaped by forces far beyond the underworld. New generations arrived who never saw Bumpy Johnson in person, never heard his voice, never watched him sit calmly while danger hovered inches away. Yet his influence remained embedded in the culture, subtle but persistent. People didn't always know where certain rules came from, only that breaking them led to consequences. That kind of inherited awareness is rare. It doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from history remembered quietly, passed down without ceremony, absorbed rather than announced. Those who truly understood Bumpy's legacy knew it was never about winning every battle. It was about choosing the battles that mattered and making sure they never had to be fought again. He understood that power, once proven decisively, could be maintained through consistency rather than confrontation. That lesson protected Harlem long after the man himself was gone. Outsiders sensed it even if I couldn't explain it. There was an unspoken boundary that discouraged intrusion, a feeling that certain moves would trigger consequences no one wanted to face. In many ways, Bumpy's greatest victory came after his death. Harlem didn't collapse. It didn't erupt into endless violence. It didn't become easy prey. That stability shocked those who believed power only survived through constant enforcement. Bumpy had demonstrated the opposite. By mastering information, psychology, and timing, he had reduced the need for force. Violence became the last option, not the first response. That mindset outlived him. The story of Lenox Lounge remained the clearest example of that philosophy. No blood spilled, no bodies dropped, yet the impact was greater than most wars. It exposed betrayal, neutralized a threat, and delivered a message that reached across state lines. It reminded everyone watching that real control doesn't panic. It waits, it prepares. And when the moment arrives, it allows the truth to reveal itself. That is why the story continues to be told, not because of the crime, but because of the clarity. In a world driven by impulse and aggression, Bumpy Johnson proved that foresight could be more powerful than force. He didn't just survive his enemies, he outgrew them. And long after Harlem changed faces, buildings, and rhythms, that lesson remained. Power is not taken in the moment of attack. It is secured long before anyone realizes they are already too late.